Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I'm a certified yoga teacher, Kilabi Inquiries facilitator, ordained minister, and meditation teacher. I also do sound healing and kirtan. So if these are things that interest you, please subscribe to the channel. Today I wanted to talk a little bit or follow up on my talk about faith, great doubt, and what that might look like in real life, and give you a couple of real life examples that we all pretty much are aware of from history. So the examples are Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Now, I think it's become quite popular in recent days to put down these kinds of figures or to find fault with them, or to say that, they're somehow not aligned with current values, that they weren't extreme enough, or that nonviolence doesn't really do anything. But that's simply not true. If we look at history, we look at the time that these gentlemen lived and the changes that they helped to facilitate, it's pretty much undeniable that they had a huge impact. And so they were able to do this non-violently, and I think that that's really probably the only way it would really happen. And they were both men of faith. Now, what's interesting about them being men of faith is, on the surface level, they had different faiths, right? So this is, I think, especially an issue for Christians, because many Christians believe that the Christian doctrine is somehow espousing that that's the only doctrine, and that's the only way to reach the divine or reach God. I understand why they believe this. This is what's been taught from the church, and this serves the church. It serves the church as an institution. But is it true? That's really the question we need to ask. And in this example, again, we see two men of faith with different faith traditions, and yet we see very similar results. So my experience and what I teach, and from all the evidence that I see studying this stuff, is this idea that there's only one right way, that my way is the right way, is simply really not aligned with truth or reality. If God truly loves all beings and all creation, why in the world would God put a message in one individual in one small part of the world and then hope that that is going to reach everybody? Again, I know that the church and Christians espouse that, oh, this is what's going to happen. Everyone gets to hear God's message, has an opportunity. But obviously, some people get to have a front row seat, right? Jesus' disciples. And then other people need to hear it maybe fourth hand from someone who maybe isn't very articulate. Are these really fair? So again, you believe whatever you want to believe. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I am just explaining from my point of view, this doesn't really make sense. What we will probably find is that the divine manifests for all people in all cultures, in all times. That it's not exclusive to one group. It's not exclusive to one message. That God will reach you however God reaches you. So with that out of the way, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, both men of deep, devout faith. And what's interesting about their faith is, because they had faith in God, they had faith in man. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Because they had faith in the divine, that we are all divinely created, they had faith in their fellow man. Now, this is a very, very powerful concept, and it's one that I practice, and I recommend that you practice. And it can be difficult to practice. I'm not saying I practice it perfectly. I have moments, or even days or weeks or months or perhaps even years, where I might fall back into the conventional view. And again, I'm mostly talking about our fellow human beings, okay? Because it's so easy for us to judge our fellow human beings. Animals, we tend not to judge them as much, right? Does anyone get mad at a tiger for eating a gazelle? Has anyone gotten really upset about that? Is there protests about that? And yet, human beings will get very upset with one another for making certain dietary choices. And they'll protest, they'll get upset, they'll write letters, they'll do all kinds of things. So again, when it comes to judgment, with human beings, we tend to judge one another. And what A Course in Miracles is telling us is this is not the way. This is not God's way, and this isn't really the way for us to have harmony and peace and to manifest love on this planet. That we all need to be free to make our own choices. And this idea of faith is, again, one way that we can allow this to happen. It's one way that we can encourage our minds to let go of its limited egoic perspective that it knows what's best for everybody. It knows what's best for the planet. It knows what's best. And it softens that. And it allows a different perspective to start to come in. So both Gandhi and Martin Luther King, men of faith. Gandhi, I think his favorite scripture was the Bhagavad Gita. Martin Luther King, of course, was the Bible. So again, different scriptures from different traditions, different cultures, different times. But the result that they came up with was very, very similar. So what is the result I speak of? Well, I have a feeling you probably already know these are not obscure figures. They're figures from recent history that I think most people have some awareness of, especially if you have any interest in spirituality, and you probably wouldn't be watching this if you didn't. So both Martin Luther King and Gandhi were able to shift or change the legal and social structure of the communities and nations in which they lived through nonviolent means. Now again, the ego tends to tell us that other people are against us. They are evil. They don't want what's best for us. So in order to get them to yield, we must use violence. We must use coercion. We must use manipulation. We can't be vulnerable. We can't let our guard down. We can't have faith that they will make the right choice. Now, what you see with both of these men, and again, say whatever you want about them personally. I'm not interested in that. I don't think that that's important. If someone has some personal issues that they need to work through as an individual, that does not mean that they are not using spiritual principles. Okay, this is again, non-judgment, all right? Very, very important for us. So I am not saying that these two gentlemen were perfect or that everything that they did was perfect. I suspect if we met Jesus, if we met Buddha, if we met Krishna, we would have much the same opinion of them as well. But because of the way time and history works, these figures are lost in myth. So they come to us as presented as somehow perfect, without flaw, without fault. What we find with modern teachers very often is because of the age we live in, where we have access to so much information, these teachers are exposed for what they are. Human. Nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean they aren't accessing or using, again, these spiritual truths to create powerful change. This is what I want to share with you, not the idea that they had somehow achieved some kind of perfection that we need to emulate. We only really need to emulate or borrow from them the power of these principles. And then whether or not they had unresolved issues or shadow doesn't really matter to us. It doesn't negate what they were able to achieve, okay? I think most of us understand this when it comes to great artists. We very often find that artists are tortured souls, and they may make personal choices that are very questionable. But it doesn't necessarily prevent us from enjoying what came through them, the art that came through them, the music, the art, the poetry that came through them. Spiritual teachers are very much the same way, that there's something coming through them, a truth, a connection, something coming through them, and their own personal journey doesn't necessarily interfere with that. Can it? Sure, it can. But again, I think we can even learn from this as well, in a sense, maybe what not to do. Okay, so both of these gentlemen were able to create very powerful change in the cultures and the nations that they lived in. They were able to change or help change policy and government and societal views through nonviolent means. What this means is they had enough faith that God's creation was not at its core, at its root, evil. Now, where does faith come in? They were seeing day after day evidence to the contrary. I want you to really grasp that, because the argument against what I'm teaching here about faith is, well, that's not what I see. Okay, I see violence. I see people not being kind to one another. I see people abusing the environment. I see all these awful, terrible, horrible things. People are just evil, and they don't deserve faith. They don't deserve forgiveness. They don't deserve understanding. Isn't this what we want to, isn't this our default, most of us? If we don't have faith, if we haven't learned to trust, this is what our eyes and our ears tell us. This is what the media is telling us. This is what our friends and neighbors tell us. Oh, you can't trust them. Oh, you can't let your guard down. Oh, you can't be vulnerable. Isn't that right? So, again, this is what I would call conventional viewpoint. And I'm not saying that there isn't evidence for it. I'm not saying that there isn't a kind of truth to it. So this is one way of operating, that we are seeing things from this egoic perspective. And the Course in Miracles very clearly states that the ego speaks loudest and speaks first. So this is where the concept of the still small voice comes in for us. That if we meditate and we get quiet and we get still and we invite in another perspective, this perspective is there. Another way of seeing things. A way of compassion versus judgment. In many ways, compassion and judgment could be seen as yin-yang to one another, opposite to one another. And what do I mean by this? Well, again, somebody treats me poorly. What does my ego tell me? What is the first thing that I think, usually, most of the time? Again, you can train yourself out of this, but this takes mind training. For most, it takes practice, it takes discipline, it takes a willingness to open ourselves up to another perspective. So the default perspective for most is going to be, they're horrible. Look at what they did to me. They treated me so poorly. What a bad or evil person they must be. And again, we can find plenty of evidence to back this up. This is what the ego is good at. And the Course says very clearly that our ego or spirit will bring back the messages that we want. And this is a very interesting concept. And again, in my experience, true. What do we want to see? Do we want to see the good, or do we want to see evil? So the answer is, you're going to see what you want to see. There is no good or bad, ultimately. That is in the eyes of the beholder. So I can take the same scenario the same person, the same events, and through the eyes of the ego, I can see the worst, most traumatic, awful things in the world. Something that is an aberration to the good, something that should have never happened. Very, very easy. Okay, again, conventional. I'm not saying it doesn't have a certain kind of truth. I'm not saying you can't find evidence for it. Okay? But, however, we can see that if we want, we can divide it in a different perspective. And I'd like to share an example of this that some of you may have heard in the past, but some of you have not. And this example comes from Tibetan Buddhism. So when China invaded Tibet and shut down all the monasteries, because China is a secular society, they don't believe that you should have religion, and Buddhism was seen as a religion. So the monasteries were shut down, and the monks were taken into concentration camps. So they were there with like political, people who were enemies of the state in China, people who had written protest letters or done other things to try and stir up opposition to the government. So these people were not treated well. They were tortured. They were given just terrible living conditions. Now, when some of the concentration camps were shut down, I'm not sure what changed. Maybe the Mao died or something like that. Maybe there's a new government or new policy. Anyway, many of these people were let out of the concentration camp, including many of these monks. Maybe they realized that, they don't need to have them in a concentration camp. They just can make it illegal for them to teach what they teach. Anyway, these people coming out of the concentration camps, what you found is that the vast majority of them, if not all of them, were traumatized by the events of what happened in the concentration camp, except for the Buddhist monks. So how is this possible? How can two people, one a Buddhist monk and one an average Chinese person, a political, agitator, how can they both go into the same situation, the same camp, and one of them comes out traumatized, so they are having flashbacks, they are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, they have all kinds of physical, mental, and emotional wounds. How can one emerge from that situation like that and the other person emerge unscathed? Okay, so again, the power of mind, the power of belief, the power of faith. My understanding is that the Buddhist monks, because of the teaching of karma, viewed their lot in the concentration camp as something that they must have earned karmically, if not in this life, then in a past life. So they basically said, okay, if I'm being tortured, I'm being treated this way, I must have been a real jerk at some point. I somehow deserve this. And so they were able to let go of the situation. They were able to see the people torturing them not as evil people, but as somebody simply doing their job, right? And that maybe somebody who's actually doing them a favor, because if they could take care of this karmic debt, you might say, then perhaps they'll be able to move on to better things in this life or the next life. So again, just perspective, just mind. And this is the power of spirituality, to reframe, to give us another way of seeing and viewing things that has real results. Because what people always want to say is, well, you're just deluding yourself. And so, yeah, you might be more happy, but that's not really the way things are. That's not really what's happening. Well, tell me which you prefer. If you had to be in a concentration camp? Would you rather emerge from the concentration camp unscathed or with post-traumatic stress disorder? Your choice. Do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? This is really the question that we want to ask ourselves. Because if I want to be happy, then I can't be right. I can't insist on being right. Look at the facts. Look at this. This is what it is. So this is really the thrust of today's talk in these examples. Both Martin Luther King and Gandhi had countless examples of people being terrible to one another. They had personally been beaten, okay, and put in jail and persecuted, okay? Personally. Jesus as well is a great example of this. This is somebody who came to teach love and the power of love, and his message was not welcome. And both Gandhi and Martin Luther King were also teaching this, that through love, through faith, through belief in our fellow human being, we can transform the world. We can raise others up by having faith in them. They can show us their worst, okay? They show us they're depraved. They show us that they are prone to violence. I mean, think again of Jesus. What was shown to him? You know, violence, fear, a willingness to simply cancel or shut down a message that is threatening. And his message was love. I want to be very clear about that. But people in his time thought that that was a threat to the status quo, because it probably was, to be honest with you. The message of love in this world is very much in opposition to how a lot of the power structures operate. And so those power structures that are usually egoic power structures, they obviously feel threatened by the message. It makes perfect sense. So why would they not want to shut it down? And if they have all the power, then they are able to. But what we find is somehow the message still gets through. We still know who Jesus is. We still know who Martin Luther King and Gandhi are. But I will say this, that very often the message is co-opted. So I don't want to point any fingers or name any names, but there are people who will teach in the name of Jesus Christ who are not really teaching what Jesus Christ was trying to teach. They're not really teaching his message. They're serving themselves, they're serving the ego, they're serving an institution. They're not actually serving truth, love, compassion, forgiveness. And these are the things that Jesus was, you might say, in service to. Love at the end of the day. So these two gentlemen, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, they were rooted in faith. And what that led them to, again, was faith in their fellow human being. You could say, children of God, the children of the divine. That if the divine is good, then what the divine creates is good. And that, again, faith is denial of what our senses are telling us in service of a deeper truth, of something that transcends what we can sense and experience with our senses. It, however, does not mean it doesn't have an effect. Again, we can see the effect that these two gentlemen had. And what they did was, again, they raised up their fellow human being. So they were actually able to get people to implement policies, to make changes, to behave better than what those people maybe even thought that they could. They were able to inspire, again, in spirit. They were able to draw forth from others perhaps more than those people thought that they could. Now, again, like almost everything I share in these talks, these are practices. As many of you know, I teach physical yoga. I teach chanting. I share many, many practices with people because these practices are very, very powerful. However, in my experience, these lay a foundation or a groundwork. The real work for me happens moment by moment, day by day, in our everyday life, not solely while we're on our cushion or our yoga mat or doing our spiritual practices. If we can use those practices to prepare the ground for these other perspectives and practices, then there isn't really a moment where we can't be practicing. And for me, this practice I'm sharing with you here is one of the most beautiful practices. Seeing the best in others, interpreting the best in others. What did Jesus say when he was on the cross? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is a great teaching, okay? If others are treating us poorly, if they are less than their spiritual potential, that is because they know not what they do. They don't know the nature of reality. I shared a talk several weeks back from Muso Soseki, and it was again about great doubt and great faith. And he said, "You do not understand the nature of the world." And this is very important. A Course in Miracles says the same thing, that our understanding and the way we interpret sense data is not really the way things actually are. And so again, this willingness to open ourselves up to another way of seeing things, to invite it in, to welcome it, to choose it over the ego. Again, the ego speaks first and it speaks loudest. So getting quiet, right? In the Bible it says, be still and know. So being still, quieting, stilling the body, quieting the mind, beginning to feel the heart, inviting in another way to see things. From here, we become so powerful and we get to move in the world in a very different way that again inspires others in spirit. Okay, we are bringing heaven to earth. And according to the Taoist tradition, this is really the purpose of a human life. We are meant to come here, and while our senses and our mind and our culture might teach fear and separation and greed and all of these types of things, we are invited through our spiritual practices and discipline to begin to reinterpret the world of senses, the world we're experiencing, to have faith in something that is beyond this surface level, you might say, of experience. And the funny thing is it actually has real world results. Again, we can see in the instance of Gandhi and Martin Luther King that these men had so much faith and influence, they were able to actually shift the trajectory of the nations that they lived in. I'm not saying those changes might not have happened at a certain point, but it may have been a lot later, and it may not have been as much of a change. Really, there's no point in conjecture, just it is what it is. And we see them right at the center of these movements. And we also see that since they have passed on and are no longer part of the dialogue, we maybe see that things have perhaps stalled a bit, that things don't seem to be progressing at the same rate. Or for me, I would say with the same quality of love and faith. We see even in movements that claim to be motivated by justice and fairness and all of these things, we see a lot of judgment coming in. We see a lot of fear coming in. We see a lot of doubt in the nature of other human beings. And for me, I don't think this actually leads to good outcomes, even if on the surface, again, because this is not about surface interpretation. If you're interested in facts, you go to the news channel. It's not what this channel is about, okay? This is about spirituality. And again, often the spiritual truth is beyond what we can see and experience with our senses. Again, it doesn't mean that the spiritual truth doesn't have an ultimate effect on things. That's the whole point of this talk. Gandhi and Martin Luther King had a measurable effect on the things of this world. And this is what is true for you and I as well. Maybe we are not of the level, and maybe it's not our life path to influence a nation, okay, or a government, or a society. I don't think that's important. You have your own sphere of influence. So, an example might be your children. They're your children. You brought them into the world. You love them. How do you interpret their actions? Do you see them as divinely inspired, as pure love, as when they are behaving less than their best selves, that they are not evil, but simply confused at that moment? They believe that they need to behave in a way that's below their best nature in order to get what they want. Again, the Course says very clearly that there's no sin. That if we interpret that behavior as sinful, as bad, as wrong, as evil, then we're actually ultimately going to judge ourselves in the same light, because we all make mistakes, folks. We're all human. So from the perspective of the ego, we all make mistakes. And so we all deserve to be judged. But from the perspective of faith and love, we're perfect, just as God created us, because God creates perfectly for all eternity. Time, space are an illusion. Okay? It doesn't mean that we ignore time and space. It's our experience. We have to, in a sense, deal with it. We have to learn from it. And again, what we're invited to do by these traditions is to look beyond the appearances, look beyond the interpretation of the ego, which is the easy way to see things. Okay, that is the default way. That is without some spiritual underpinning or understanding. That is the way you will default to seeing things. Okay, that's why this channel exists. That's why great spiritual traditions exist, is they are an invitation to look at things in a different way. Is this easy? No. Most things that are worth doing aren't that easy. And that's why they're called spiritual practices, because they require us to, in a sense, fail, and fail often, but never give up. So even though we find ourselves in judgment, we find ourselves thinking the worst of our children, right? We have an opportunity in that moment. And again, this is something that we practice moment by moment every day, okay? I love the way that Byron Katie puts this. She says that anytime you experience negative emotion, anytime, she says you are believing something that is ultimately not true. So what is meant by that ultimately? Again, conventionally, in the world of time and space, in the world of evidence, you might be able to find ego evidence that says, no, but it is true. They did this, they did that, they behaved this way, they said that. Again, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, what evidence did they have in the world for the goodness of their fellow human beings? At the time, I don't think there was much, to be quite honest with you. Where did they tap into this belief and faith? From their scriptures, okay? From their faith within them, the belief, the experience, because again, I don't think faith needs to be only from a scripture or from a teaching. As we begin to apply faith in our lives, we very often see more and more evidence that it actually does affect the outcomes in the world. And so these gentlemen, they may have applied these teachings early in their life. And as they did that, it changed their opinion of how the world operates. Again, you could say this is really about a deeper level of the operating system of the world. So we can operate on the most surface level, but below that, there is a deeper operating system, a deeper truth that we can tap into. And again, what I'd like to say is it produces real world results. That's how you know you're really tapping into it, is you actually begin to see the results in your life. If you don't, if you're simply plugging your ears, you know, la 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 la, I don't see evil, I don't see evil, then I would say that probably this is not what I'm talking about. It's not about your head in the sand. It's not about trying to block out the reality of the world or deny the reality of the world. It's again about transcending, looking past or beyond toward a deeper truth, and realizing that any action in this world, any event can be interpreted in multiple ways. It really is up to us to choose how we will interpret this. So again, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, they could have interpreted their fellow human beings' behavior as people are just awful, white people are awful, they're racist, they want to keep my people down, they deserve to be killed, we need to stand up for our rights and be violent. Again, many people might believe this is true now, but I'd say most of those people probably have not created the type of change that Gandhi and Martin Luther King were able to through nonviolent means. So what did they do? They put themselves in harm's way. They said, I have so much faith and belief in you, I will put myself in harm's way. Okay? And as a result, they were able to get these amazing changes to happen. Now, some people might look at their lives and say, well, they were assassinated. That shows that they failed. They didn't. We all die at one point or another. Jesus was crucified. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Gandhi also towards the end of his life. Does this mean that they failed? No. They were able to bring heaven to earth. And what can be more fulfilling than that? They were able to bring a little bit of heaven, that vision of unity, of oneness, of love, of faith in a higher power beyond what the ego wants us to believe, because the ego wants to be our God. The ego wants to be truth, right? Isn't that what your mind tells you? No, Doug. I don't believe that. That's not true. I know what's true, and it's not that. But again, this is not the purvey of spirituality. It never has been, and it never will be. I'm not saying that spirituality is in opposition to science. I don't think that it is. But we have to understand each has its place in our understanding. And spirituality is about reaching beyond what we currently understand and know towards something deep within all of us and all of existence. It is something we do have access to. And as I pointed out many times in this talk, it is something that has an effect on the world we live in. It's not about denying this reality. In fact, it's about making this reality a better version of itself, actually helping this reality, yourself and others, be what they can be, what they were meant to be. As I said, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they raised others up. They raised their cultures and societies up. They were able to make the countries that they lived in a better place to live for more people. Okay, this is very powerful. They were standing for truth and justice and love, and these are very powerful forces. It may feel like when you stand for these things that you're going to lose. And again, this is the ego narrative. But we have to be willing to take that risk. As I said, Martin Luther King and Gandhi both actually risked their lives, physical violence and harm to themselves. They experienced it firsthand. And they did this, again, through the power of faith. So faith, again, very, very powerful. And again, as you experience it in your life, you have more and more of it. Okay, but you have to be willing to risk it. Okay, it's not enough to say, well, I have faith, but I'm not going to act on it, because then you will not experience its power. Okay, so I have faith that my children can be their best selves. I don't need to beat them. I don't need to shame them. I don't need to make them feel guilty. I can love them. I can teach them. I can point to truth, and they will understand and they will rise up to that. Again, a very, very different way than most of us are used to dealing with situations. And I'm just using children as an example. Spouse. Okay, maybe you are in a loveless marriage and you just see your spouse is shut off, shut down, not spiritual, not awake, somebody you can't relate to or talk to now that you're on the spiritual path. Well, are you ready for them to surprise you? Are you willing to let them surprise you? What about your boss? What about your work? Right? Oh, well, they're asleep. They'll never understand. They're always motivated by money. They're just looking for profit. Okay. Is there another way of looking at this situation, inviting in another way of seeing it, interpreting events? And again, very often when we do this, things begin to shift and change for us. Our partner might change, or we might find that just very naturally and easily that relationship ends up dissolving. We find that we were only there out of fear and a sense of lack and a sense of scarcity. And we all of a sudden begin to feel the abundance, and we have faith that we will be taken care of. So again, this is a practice, and it's something that can be brought into any aspect of your life. It's something for you to do moment by moment. You're choosing always, whether you realize it or not. Course in Miracles states very clearly, moment by moment, you're making a choice. You're choosing to walk toward heaven, or you're choosing to walk toward hell. How are you choosing that? When you choose fear, when you choose separation, okay, which is what fear is, the other will not do right by me. Then we are choosing hell, and we will suffer accordingly. That's how you know. It's a perfect system. You suffer to the degree that you are believing something that is not of ultimate truth, okay? The other choice is love, faith, okay? When you choose love, you're choosing heaven. How do you know? You experience this world as heaven. Yes, people can still say, look at the news, look at how awful it is, it's terrible. How can you say this is heaven? Because that's what you feel in your heart. Yes, you still see all the things, but your experience of them is different. Again, instead of seeing evildoers, you see people that are confused, who don't understand their own power, their own strength, who are motivated by this fear, which really isn't the truth, the ultimate truth. We're all here because of grace, because of a gift. We didn't create this. We didn't create our experience. It was given to us, gifted to us. And it was gifted to us so we could experience love, peace, and joy. So if we are not experiencing those things, then it must be because we are interpreting things incorrectly. We are confused. And this is what the Course teaches. All right, everyone, thank you for listening. If you're still here, consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. That helps support these talks. You can also make a one-time contribution, and the links for that are down below. If you're on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and comment, as that helps spread this message to more people. And hopefully it can help others as it's helped you. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And until next time, namaste and have a beautiful day.